The auctioneer's voice, a gravelly drone honed by decades of selling off men's dreams and failures, barely registered over the biting November wind. It whipped across the frozen mud of the Henderson farmstead, carrying with it the scent of diesel and despair. I stood near the back, my hands shoved deep into the pockets of my canvas work coat, the collar turned up against the cold. My eyes weren't on the tidy line of late-model tractors or the gleaming six-bottom plough that was causing a stir. They were fixed on the thing huddled behind the barn, a forgotten metal behemoth that the other farmers walked past with a chuckle or a shake of the head. It was a Massey Ferguson 760 combine, or what was left of one. Rust had bled down its faded red panels in long, weeping streaks. The tires were cracked and flat, sinking into the earth as if the machine had already accepted its grave. A thicket of burdock and thistle had grown up around the massive grain head, its teeth dull and broken. It was a monument to failure, a machine parked after a catastrophic breakdown and left to be consumed by the unforgiving Iowa seasons. "Look at Miller," a voice snickered behind me. I didn't have to turn to know it was Richard Peterson. His voice had the same slick, overconfident tone as the new paint on his pickup truck, probably trying to figure out if he can melt it down for scrap. A few of his buddies laughed. I ignored them, my gaze tracing the lines of the dead machine. Peterson was the new king of Black Hawk County. He farmed nearly 2,000 acres, all of it leveraged to the hilt with the bank's money. He'd just taken delivery of a brand new John Deere 7700, the kind with an enclosed cab, air conditioning, and a radio. He called farming agribusiness and talked about cash flow and depreciation schedules like a man who'd never had to bust a knuckle on a seized bolt. I, on the other hand, was farming the same 320 acres my father had farmed, and his father before him. My prized tractor was a 1968 John Deere 4020, a machine I knew better than I knew most people. It was paid for. Everything I owned was paid for. My father's last words to me on his deathbed weren't about love or the afterlife. They were, "Don't you ever owe the bank a dime you can't pay back tomorrow, son. Interest is a thief in the night." That lesson was branded onto my soul. The auctioneer finally moved on from the shiny equipment and gestured dismissively toward the derelict combine. "All right, folks, what are we going to do with this?" "This yard art," he barked, trying to get a laugh. "Engines seized, tires are shot. We're selling it for scrap value, as is, where is. You haul it. Who'll give me $500 for the whole pile? $500. Silence. The wind howled. A few men grinned and nudged each other. Peterson let out a loud theatrical sigh. "Might get $50 for it at the scrapyard if you pay for the trucking," he called out. I'd spent an hour that morning before the auction crowd arrived, crawling over and under that machine. I'd pulled the dipstick. The oil was black and thick, but there was no water in it. I'd popped the inspection plate on the bell housing. The clutch wasn't shattered, the final drives weren't cracked. The frame itself, a massive spine of heavy steel, was straight and true. The real problem was the heart of the beast, a Perkins 354 cubic inch 8-cylinder diesel engine. It was locked up tighter than a banker's fist. But I saw potential where they saw junk. This machine, when it was new in the early 70s, was a monster. It had a 20-foot grain head and a grain tank that could hold 190 bushels. It was built to eat acres, built with steel that modern machines could only dream of. "Come on, gentlemen, don't be shy," the auctioneer pleaded. "Gimme $200 to haul it away." I saw Peterson catch my eye. He gave me a mocking little smirk, a look that said, "You and this piece of junk belong together, Miller." That was all it took. I lifted my chin, just enough for the auctioneer to see. "200, I said, my voice clear and steady. A ripple of murmurs went through the crowd. Peterson's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of genuine disbelief. He looked from me to the rusting hulk and back again, as if trying to solve a puzzle. "I got 200 from Frank Miller," the auctioneer crowed, suddenly energized. "Who'll give me 250? 250 now." The crowd was dead silent. No one was going to bid against me on this folly. It was my folly alone. "Sold." The auctioneer slammed his hand down on his ledger. "For $200, to the man with more ambition than sense." The laughter this time was louder, less restrained. Peterson just shook his head slowly, a pitying smile on his face as he walked away to bid on a brand new set of disc chisels. As the crowd dispersed, I walked toward my purchase. The sheer scale of it was intimidating. The top of the grain tank was a good 12 feet off the ground. The drive wheels were taller than I was. It smelled of rust, mice, and decay. I placed a hand on the cold, pitted sheet metal of the engine cover. It was like touching the hide of a dead elephant. In my mind, I could already hear the roar of that V8 diesel, could feel the vibration through the steel platform, could smell the sweet dust of dry corn pouring into the tank. Everyone else saw a pile of scrap metal. I saw an empire in hibernation. Getting it home was the first battle in a long war. It took me the better part of a week to prepare. The tires wouldn't hold air for more than 10 minutes, so I had to haul my old air compressor out to the Henderson place and keep filling them as I worked. I used two 20-ton hydraulic jacks and a stack of oak cribbing to lift the front end enough to get the grain head detached. The bolts were rusted solid, each one a bare-knuckle fight with a 4-foot breaker bar. My knuckles were raw and bleeding by the end of the first day. Peterson drove by twice in his heated pickup, slowing down to watch me wrestle with the rusted machinery in the freezing wind. He never offered to help. He just watched. When I finally got the head loaded onto a hay rack, the real challenge began. Moving the main body, the combine weighed over 15,000 pounds. I borrowed a heavy-duty triple-axle trailer from Old Man Hemmings, who looked at me with the same pity as everyone else, but was too kind to say anything. The problem was getting the dead machine onto it. I had only one tool big enough for the job, my father's 1951 Farmall M, a tractor that had been born before I was. It was ugly and crude, but it was a brute. I hooked a logging chain to the combine's solid rear axle and another to the Farmall's drawbar. I put the Farmall in its lowest gear and slowly let out the clutch. The chain snapped taut with a deafening groan. The M's rear wheels dug into the frozen ground, spinning uselessly. The engine, a simple 4-cylinder gas burner, bellowed in protest. It was no good. The combine wouldn't budge. It was anchored to the earth. I spent the next 2 days digging out the sunken tires, jacking the frame, and laying down heavy planks to create a makeshift ramp onto the trailer. On the third attempt, with the Farmall screaming at full throttle and the smell of burning clutch hanging heavy in the air, the combine finally moved. It scraped and groaned its way up the planks, a sound like the world's biggest fingernail on the world's biggest chalkboard. When it was finally settled on the trailer bed, I was so exhausted I could barely stand. I sat on the frozen ground, my back against the trailer tire, and just looked at my prize. It looked even bigger and more hopeless now that it was ready to be towed down a public road. You know, before we go any further with this story, I have to ask you something. Have you ever taken on a project that everyone, and I mean everyone, told you was a complete waste of time? A car, a piece of equipment, maybe something around the house. A project that was so big and so hopeless that people openly laughed at you for even trying. If you have, drop a comment down below and tell me what it was. I want to know I'm not the only stubborn fool in the world. The journey back to my farm was 5 miles of pure terror. I towed the massive load with my 4020, its diesel engine pulling steady and strong. But the weight of that combine on the trailer behind me was a living thing, constantly trying to push me off the road or into a ditch. I crept along at 5 miles an hour, my hands clenched white on the steering wheel, my eyes darting between the road ahead and the rearview mirror. When I finally turned into my own lane and parked the monstrous thing next to my machine shed, a wave of relief so powerful washed over me that my knees felt weak. My wife, Sarah, came out of the house, wiping her hands on her apron. She stopped and just stared at the thing. She didn't say a word for a full minute. Sarah was a farm girl herself. She knew machinery. She understood the difference between a project and a pipe dream. "Frank," she finally said, her voice quiet but firm, "what have you done?" "I bought us a combine, honey," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "No," she said, walking closer to it, her eyes scanning the rot and rust. "You bought a parts machine, except we don't have the machine it's supposed to supply parts for. How much did they pay you to haul it off?" "I paid $200 for it." She closed her eyes and took a slow breath. $200. That's a month's worth of groceries, Frank. For that, "Sarah, look at the frame. Look at the size of the axles. They don't build them like this anymore. If I can get this engine running, this machine will outlast anything Peterson buys from the bank." "If," she said, the word hanging in the cold air between us. "That's a mighty big if, Frank. The coffee shop talk is already bad enough. They're calling you Scrap Iron Miller." I clenched my jaw. Let them talk. Talk is cheap. It's sweat that gets the work done. The winter of 1972 was one of the coldest I can remember. While other farmers were mending fences or taking trips down to Florida, my machine shed became my entire world. I rigged up a block and tackle from the main beam, and with the help of the 4020's front-end loader, I managed to hoist the Perkins V8 out of the combine's chassis. It swung there like a carcass in a butcher shop, enormous and inert. The teardown began. Every bolt was a war. I heated them with an acetylene torch until they glowed cherry red, then quenched them with penetrating oil, the acrid smoke filling the shed and burning my eyes. I used breaker bars with pipes on the end for more leverage, my muscles screaming in protest. The engine was caked in a half-inch thick layer of oily grime that had hardened into a shell. It was like performing archaeology, chipping away the layers of neglect to find the machine underneath. The real problem, as I'd suspected, was that the pistons were seized solid in their cylinders. Water had gotten in through the rusty exhaust stack and sat there for years, fusing the iron rings to the cylinder walls. This was the point of no return. This was the problem that had made the previous owner give up. For 3 weeks, I tried every trick I knew. I filled the cylinders with a 50-50 mix of acetone and automatic transmission fluid, a concoction old mechanics swore by. I let it soak, tapping the top of the pistons with a wooden block and a hammer every day, hoping to break the bond. Nothing. I put a 6-foot bar on the crankshaft bolt and put my entire weight on it, rocking it back and forth, hour after hour, until sweat poured down my face in the freezing shed. I felt a flicker of movement once, a microscopic give, but then it locked up again, solid as granite. The talk in town got worse. Peterson made sure of it. He'd hold court at the grain elevator, telling everyone how he saw me out in my shed at all hours, fighting a losing battle with a boat anchor. "Poor Frank," he'd say, loud enough for everyone to hear. His daddy taught him how to save a dollar, but not how to make one. He's so scared of the bank, he'd rather work himself to death on a piece of junk than invest in the future. Even my banker, Mr. Harris, pulled me aside after church one Sunday. "Frank," he said, his face a mask of false concern, "I hear you're undertaking a significant mechanical project. You know, we have excellent financing programs for new equipment. A man like Richard Peterson, he understands that you have to spend money to make money. He's looking at trading up again already. That's how you get ahead." "I'll get ahead my own way, Mr. Harris," I said, my voice colder than I intended. "The way that lets me sleep at night." I was at my breaking point. I was exhausted, my hands were cracked and bleeding, and the doubt was starting to creep in. Maybe they were right. Maybe I had wasted my money and my winter on a fool's errand. One night I sat on an overturned bucket in the shed, staring at the seized engine block ready to give up. I thought about my father's words. I thought about Peterson's smug face. I thought about the pity in Sarah's eyes. Then I had an idea. It was an old, brutal trick my grandfather had told me about. A last resort for hopelessly seized engines. The next morning, I bolted the engine block down to a heavy steel plate. I built a small, contained fire of charcoal briquettes under the oil pan, heating the entire block slowly and evenly. The idea was to make the iron block expand just a fraction more than the steel piston rings inside it. It was dangerous. Too much heat, and I could crack the block, rendering it useless. I kept the fire low and steady for hours, checking the temperature with my hand. The shed filled with the smell of burning oil and hot metal. When the block was too hot to touch for more than a second, I knew it was time. I grabbed the 6-foot breaker bar again, fitted it to the crankshaft bolt, and took a deep breath. I pulled. For a moment, nothing happened. The bar bent under the strain. I put every ounce of my strength into it, my teeth gritted, a growl rising in my throat. And then I heard it. Not a loud crack, but a low, deep groan, a sound of protest, like ancient ice breaking apart. The bar moved. It moved an inch. My heart hammered in my chest. I rocked the bar back, then forward again. It moved another inch. The bond was broken. I worked it back and forth, slowly, patiently, for what felt like an eternity. With each movement, it got a little easier. Finally, with a long, scraping sigh, the crankshaft made a full rotation. The pistons were free. I let go of the bar and fell back against the workbench, breathing heavily, my body trembling with exhaustion and triumph. I had won. The heart of the Titan was going to beat again. The rest of the winter was a blur of methodical, painstaking work. I honed the cylinder walls, installed new rings, new bearings, new gaskets. I rebuilt the massive fuel injection pump on my kitchen table, carefully laying out the tiny springs and check valves on a clean white cloth, much to Sarah's dismay. I had to order parts from as far away as England, waiting weeks for packages to arrive. I rewired the entire machine, replacing brittle, mouse-chewed wires with heavy-gauge copper. I patched the rust holes in the sheet metal with new steel, my welds ugly but strong. By the time the spring planting season arrived, the combine was still in pieces. I had to put it all on hold to get my corn and soybeans in the ground with my trusty 40-20 and my old 6-row planter. Peterson, of course, was done in a week with his new 24-row planter, covering ground at a speed I could only dream of. He bought another 160 acres that spring, the old Henderson place where I'd bought the combine. He paid top dollar for it, all with the bank's money. The early 1970s had been good to farmers. The government, led by Secretary of Agriculture Earl Butz, was telling us to plant fence-a-row to fence-a-row. A massive grain deal with the Soviet Union had sent prices for corn and soybeans into the stratosphere. Land values were doubling, then tripling. It was a boom time, a gold rush, and Richard Peterson was riding the crest of the wave. He was a hero at the bank, a model for the modern farmer. He leveraged his rising land values to borrow more money to buy more land and bigger equipment. He tore out the old groves and fence lines to make his fields bigger and more efficient for his massive machines. He was farming with a calculator and a loan officer, and he was winning. Meanwhile, I was the county fool. I finished planting and went right back to the combine. Through the hot, humid summer, I labored. I reassembled the engine and, with a new battery and fresh diesel, I cranked it for the first time. It turned over, coughed a thick cloud of black smoke that blotted out the sun, and then roared to life. The sound was deafening, a deep-throated V8 bellow that shook the ground and rattled the windows in the house. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. Sarah came running out of the house, a smile finally breaking across her face. "You did it," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. "You actually did it." That fall, as Peterson's brand-new air-conditioned John Deere 7720 turbo rolled through his fields, I drove my Resurrected Massey Ferguson 760 out for its first test. It was ugly. The patched sheet metal was a checkerboard of faded red and raw steel. The engine was loud enough to wake the dead. The cab was open to the elements. But when I engaged the header and it chewed through that first row of corn, spitting clean golden kernels into the grain tank, I felt a satisfaction so deep, it was almost spiritual. I was slower than Peterson. I had breakdowns. A hydraulic hose burst one afternoon, covering me in hot oil. A bearing went out on the main separator shaft, and I spent a whole night taking it apart by the light of a trouble lamp. But I got the crop in, and because the prices were so high that year, I made good money, real money. At the end of the season, I went to see Mr. Harris at the bank. He greeted me with his usual patronizing smile. "Frank, come to see the light, ready to trade in that old 40-20 and get into a real tractor?" "No, sir," I said, pulling a folded piece of paper from my pocket. "I'm here to do this." I pushed the paper across the desk. It was the last payment on the operating note my father had taken out a decade ago to buy seed corn. It wasn't much, but it was the last debt to my name. I paid it off in cash. Mr. Harris looked at the payment, then at me. He didn't seem impressed. "Well, that's fine, Frank, fiscally responsible. But you know your net worth is stagnant. Richard Peterson's net worth has quadrupled in the last 3 years. He's using his assets to build an empire. You're treading water." "I'm sleeping soundly," I replied, standing up to leave. I walked out of that bank a completely free man. Every acre of my land, every piece of my machinery, from the old Farmall M to the monstrous ugly combine I now called the Titan, was mine. I owed no man a single cent. That winter I didn't buy more land, I didn't buy a new truck. I used my profits to pattern tile my wettest 40 acres, laying down thousands of feet of drainage pipe to make the soil more productive. I built a new grain bin, a big one, so I could store my harvest and wait for the best prices instead of being forced to sell right off the combine. I was investing in my foundation, in the land itself. To everyone else, I was falling further and further behind. Peterson was the man of the hour, the future of farming. I was just scrap iron Miller, the stubborn fool who'd rather sweat over a pile of junk than embrace progress. The news on the radio was starting to change, though. The reports weren't all about booming exports anymore. There were new words cropping up in the farm report: inflation, Federal Reserve, interest rates. The announcer mentioned that the prime lending rate had just ticked up another 1/4 of a point to fight rising prices. It was a small thing, a tiny cloud on a distant horizon. But as I stood in my machine shed, looking out over my paid-for fields, a cold knot tightened in my stomach. The party had been going on for a long time, and I had a feeling the bill was about to come due. The late 70s were like a long, warm afternoon in late summer. The corn stood tall and the prices held steady. For 3 straight harvests, the Titan roared to life and devoured my acres without complaint. It was never an easy process. Each season began with a week of preventative maintenance, greasing its countless zerks, checking the tension on every belt and chain, and tuning the big Perkins V8 until it purred like a giant angry cat. I knew its every groan and shudder. I could tell by the pitch of the cylinder bars if the corn was too wet, or by the vibration in the steering wheel if a bearing was thinking about giving up. I was no longer a man operating a machine. We were a single entity, a partnership of flesh and steel. Peterson kept expanding. He bought another quarter section, then another. His operation was a showcase of modern agriculture. He had 2 of the new John Deere 8640 4-wheel drive tractors, articulated beasts that pulled 30-foot cultivators. His fields were vast, unbroken seas of corn and soybeans, stretching from one horizon to the other. He traded his 7720 combine for the new 8820 model, a machine so enormous it looked like it could harvest the entire county in a day. It had a hydrostatic transmission, electronic monitors for everything from grain loss to shaft speed, and a cab so quiet you could hear the announcer on the radio whisper. He was the undisputed king, and the bank was his castle. The first sign of trouble wasn't a thunderclap, it was a lack of them. The spring of 1980 was dry. The summer that followed was a scorcher. The sky remained a pale, unforgiving blue for weeks on end. The corn, which should have been shoulder-high by the 4th of July, was barely up to my waist, its leaves curling in on themselves to conserve every precious drop of moisture. The ground baked and cracked like old pottery. Dust was a constant companion, a fine, gritty powder that coated everything and worked its way into my eyes, my lungs, and the deepest crevices of my machinery. For my old, simple equipment, the dust was a nuisance. I had to blow out the radiator fins on the 4020 twice a day to keep it from overheating. On the Titan, I spent an hour every morning with my air compressor, blasting the grit out of the engine compartment, off the belts, and away from the bearings. I took off its heavy-duty oil bath air cleaner, the kind they used on industrial equipment, and cleaned it religiously. It was a dirty, miserable job, but it was just another chore. For Peterson's new, sophisticated fleet, the dust was a poison. I saw it one afternoon in early September as I was driving past his home place. His brand new 8820 was sitting silent at the edge of a field, half a pass into the stunted, drought-stricken soybeans. A white pickup truck with the John Deere dealership logo on the door was parked beside it. 2 young mechanics in clean uniforms were staring at an open side panel, a bewildered look on their faces. I saw Peterson pacing back and forth, his arms waving as he talked on the 2-way radio in his truck. The confidence was gone from his posture. He looked like a general whose army had refused to move. I didn't stop, it wasn't my business. But I knew what was happening. Those new machines were packed with electronic sensors and micro switches. They were brilliant in perfect conditions, But the fine, abrasive dust was working its way into every connection, every circuit board, causing phantom failures and maddening intermittent shutdowns. The machine was too smart for its own good, and it was having a nervous breakdown in the middle of a field. His combine sat there for 2 days, 2 precious days of harvest, with the weather forecast starting to talk about a change. On the 3rd day, I saw them hauling it away on a lowboy trailer. The dealer couldn't fix it in the field. They had to take it back to the shop, back to the clean rooms and the diagnostic computers. Peterson had to rent a replacement machine from the dealer, at a cost that made my blood run cold just thinking about it. That was the first crack. The second came from a place none of us could control, Washington, D.C. To protest the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the president had announced a grain embargo. The biggest customer we had was suddenly gone. The market, which had been the foundation of all that borrowing and expansion, collapsed overnight. The price of corn fell by $1 a bushel almost instantly. For a man like Peterson, who had millions of bushels to sell and millions of dollars in loans, it was a body blow. For me, with my modest harvest and my big new grain bin, it was bad news, but not a death sentence. I could afford to wait. I filled my bin to the top, shut the door, and decided to see what the new year would bring. The new year brought Paul Volcker and the Federal Reserve. The news on the radio stopped being about crop prices and started being about something called the prime interest rate. It was a number that had never mattered much to me, but it was suddenly the only number anyone talked about. To fight inflation, they were raising it. And they didn't just nudge it, they launched it into orbit. 8%, 12%, 15%. It kept climbing, a relentless, terrifying ascent. For me, it was just news. For Richard Peterson, it was a noose tightening around his neck. His operating loans, the ones he used to buy his seed and fertilizer, were all on variable rates. His land payments were tied to the prime rate. His debt, which had been a tool for expansion, had suddenly transformed into a ravenous monster that was eating his empire alive. The same banker who had praised him as a visionary was now calling him every day, his voice no longer friendly but strained and demanding. The winter of 1981 was quiet and grim. The usual cheerful banter at the coffee shop was gone, replaced by hushed, worried conversations. The farm crisis had begun. The first foreclosure auction was for a young family just starting out. It was a heartbreaking affair. Then another and another. It was a plague sweeping through the countryside, and the only immunity was the one my father had drilled into me, being debt-free. Peterson began to shed assets. First to go was one of the big 4-wheel drive tractors. It sold at auction for half of what he'd paid for it 2 years earlier. The money went straight to the bank, a single drop of water on a raging fire. Then he sold off a quarter section of land, the Henderson place, the very ground where I had found the Titan. He had to sell it at a loss. Land values were cratering as fast as interest rates were rising. The foundation of his paper wealth had turned to quicksand. One Saturday morning, there was a knock at my door. It was Peterson. I almost didn't recognize him. The swagger was gone. His face was pale and drawn, his eyes hollowed out with sleepless nights. He was holding a broken hydraulic cylinder from his planter. "Frank," he said, his voice barely a whisper. He wouldn't meet my eyes. I was wondering. The dealer wants $800 for a new one, and they say it'll be 2 weeks. I heard you had a welder. I was hoping maybe you could take a look at it. He was a broken man. The king was standing on my doorstep, asking for help from the court jester. All the years of his mockery, his condescending smiles, his nickname for me, Scrap Iron Miller, it all came flooding back. It would have been so easy to say no, to tell him I was busy, to savor the moment. But looking at him, I didn't feel triumph. I felt a profound sadness. He wasn't my enemy. He was a farmer just like me. He'd just listened to the wrong prophets. "Bring it into the shed, Richard," I said, holding the door open. "Let's see what we can do." We spent the entire afternoon in my shop. I ground out the crack in the heavy steel casing, preheated the metal with my torch to prevent it from becoming brittle, and laid down a thick, strong bead with my old arc welder. We didn't talk about the banks or the interest rates. We talked about the weather, about the new seed varieties, about the right way to set a plow. We talked like two farmers. As I worked, he looked around my shed, at the neatly organized tools, at the old Farmall M in the corner, at the Titan sitting cold and silent, waiting for the fall. I saw a flicker of understanding in his eyes, a dawning realization that this was a different kind of wealth, a different kind of empire. When I was done, the world was ugly, but it was strong. I handed the cylinder back to him. "What do I owe you, Frank?" he asked, pulling out his wallet. "Nothing," I said. "Just get your corn planted, Richard. That's all that matters." He nodded, unable to speak. He turned and walked back to his truck, and for the first time, he didn't seem like a rival. He just seemed like a neighbor. But a single repaired cylinder couldn't stop the avalanche. By the summer of 1982, the bank had called his loans. The final auction was scheduled for a cold, grey day in November, 10 years to the month after the Henderson sale, where I had bought the Titan. This time, it wasn't just equipment or a parcel of land, it was everything. The home farm, the 160 acres his grandfather had homesteaded, the house he'd grown up in, the barn where he'd milked his first cow. The auction was held in the farmyard. The mood was funereal. Farmers from all over the county were there, not to find a bargain, but to bear witness. They stood in silent clusters, their hats in their hands, as if attending a wake. Richard stood by the porch with his wife and 2 young children, his face a stone mask, watching his entire world being dismantled piece by piece. The auctioneer started with the household goods, then the tools, then the small equipment. Finally, it was time for the land, the heart of the farm. Mr. Harris from the bank stepped forward to read the legal description. His voice was flat and professional, but he couldn't hide the tremor in his hands. He was a part of this community, and this was hurting him too. "All right," the auctioneer said, his voice softer than usual. "You all know what this is. 160 acres, prime Black Hawk County land, with house and outbuildings. What am I bid to start?" An uneasy silence fell over the crowd. No one wanted to be the first to pick at the bones. Finally, a voice from the back, a stranger in a suit, called out a number. He was an investor from Des Moines, a vulture who had been circling the county for months, buying up distressed farms. The bidding began, a slow, painful volley between the investor and a large corporate farm from the next county. The price climbed, but it was a fraction of what the land had been worth just a few years earlier. Richard Peterson closed his eyes, his wife burying her face in his shoulder. This was it, the final cut. His family's name would be erased from this piece of earth forever. The auctioneer's chant rose, going once, going twice. From the middle of the crowd, a clear, steady voice spoke. "I'll bid $100 an acre more." Every head turned. It was me. A wave of murmurs rippled through the farmers. Scrap Iron Miller, the man who never borrowed a dime. The investor from Des Moines looked irritated. He conferred with his partner, then upped my bid. "And 50 more," I said without hesitating. We went back and forth. The corporate farm dropped out. It was just me and the city man in the suit. He looked at me, at my worn canvas coat and my work-stained hands, and he saw a fool. He couldn't comprehend that I was bidding with my own money, with cash in the bank, not with a piece of paper from a loan officer. He raised the bid one last time, a big jump designed to scare me off. I took a deep breath. I thought of my father. I thought of the long winters in the shed, of the grease under my fingernails, of the quiet satisfaction of owning my own labor. I looked over at Richard, who was staring at me now, his mouth agape, a storm of confusion and disbelief in his eyes. I called out my final bid. It was every cent I had saved. It was the culmination of a decade of thrift and sweat. The investor threw his hands up in disgust and shook his head. The auctioneer scanned the crowd. "Going once," he called. "Going twice." He looked right at me, and a small, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. "Sold. To Frank Miller." A spontaneous cheer went up from the assembled farmers. It wasn't for my victory, it was for Richard's salvation. They swarmed around me, clapping me on the back, shaking my hand. They understood what had just happened. The land had stayed in the community. It hadn't gone to a stranger. Later that day, after the crowds were gone and a cold dusk was settling over the stripped and empty farmyard, I walked over to Richard. He was sitting on the porch steps, his head in his hands. "Why, Frank?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "After everything, all the things I said." "Because this is your home, Richard," I said, sitting down beside him. "Your name is on the mailbox. It belongs here." I pulled a piece of paper from my coat pocket. It wasn't a legal document. I'd written it out myself that morning on a piece of notebook paper. "This is my offer. You're going to rent this farm back from me. The rent will be a fair share of the crop, not cash. If the year is bad, we both take a loss. If the year is good, we both do well. You're going to work with me. We'll share equipment. And every year that you turn a profit, a portion of that will go toward buying this place back from me at the price I paid for it today. No interest." He took the paper, his hands trembling as he read it. He looked up at me, his eyes shining with tears. He couldn't speak. He just nodded, a wave of relief and gratitude so powerful it seemed to shake his whole body. The years that followed were lean, but they were good. We worked side by side, Richard and I. His knowledge of the new seed genetics and my knowledge of the old iron made for a powerful combination. We pooled our resources. My debt-free status and his larger acreage allowed us to weather the last of the farm crisis. The community watched, and the lesson was not lost on them. The flashy, debt-fueled expansion of the 70s was a fool's game. The real currency was resilience, community, and a healthy fear of a banker's smile. I never got rid of the Titan. Even after we could afford a newer, more comfortable machine, I kept it in the back of the shed. It was my monument, a reminder of where I'd come from. My son, Tom, grew up in the shadow of that machine. He learned to turn a wrench before he could properly read. I didn't teach him just how to fix things, I taught him why. I'd point to the Titan. "Look at that," I'd tell him, my hand on its thick steel frame. "They called this junk." They laughed at me. "But this machine, it doesn't have a computer to fry or a sensor to get dusty. Its strength is its simplicity. It was built to work, not to be replaced. And most importantly, it was ours. We didn't owe anyone for it. Remember that, Tom. Debt is a chain. Sometimes it's a long chain, and you feel like you can run pretty far. But the bank always holds the other end." One warm autumn evening, years later, I was standing on the hill overlooking my farm. I was an old man now, my hands gnarled and stiff, my back permanently bent from a lifetime of labor. Tom was running the combine in the fields below, a newer machine, but one he'd paid for in cash. Next to him, in the adjoining field, Richard's son was harvesting his own crop. Richard had bought the home place back from me 5 years earlier. His handshake that day was one of the proudest moments of my life. The setting sun glinted off the roof of my machine shed. I could just make out the silhouette of the Titan, parked in its place of honor. It looked less like a machine and more like a slumbering beast, its purpose served, its victory won. They had called me Scrap Iron Miller, a stubborn fool clinging to the past. But as I looked out over the land, and my neighbor's land, both of them free and clear, I knew my father's words had been true. I had slept soundly every single night, and in the quiet heartland of America, that was an empire richer than any king could ever dream of.